A lens is a crucial piece of equipment when using a camera, and if you've ever taken a picture without the lens on, you'll know it'll be just a white blank picture. When you're actually using a lens, you don't realise how much they can really do and how amazing they actually are. Lenses are a very broad topic, and once you start researching them, you're opening new doors to loads of things and you learn so much stuff. When I was researching about the lenses, I kept opening new doors to things I never even realised existed. It was really interesting and I did learn some new things, but I was going a bit off topic, so I decided I needed to find something that I wanted to learn the most and take it further so I could make a project out of it. There are so many different aspects to lenses and they're all very important, but I chose to focus on the focal length. I knew a little bit about focal length before I started my research, but while I was researching, I got more interested in it and I was intrigued to learn more. Focal length is measured in millimetres, which is the distance from the centre of the camera to the camera sensor. This basically determines the angle of view and how much the subject will be magnified. I'm now going to explain the difference in focal lengths by conducting a simple interview setup and talk about what focal length and settings would be best for several outcomes. I am going to be demonstrating these focal lengths on my 18 to 55mm kit lens. I don't have any of these actual lenses I'll be talking about, but I want to show you that you can do focal lengths just as good on a kit lens. This is setup number 1. This setup is if you want an equal ratio between the background and the subject. If you don't have access to any lenses and only have your kit lens, like I do, this is probably the best setup for you, unless you would like to experiment like I will be in these videos. This setup is very natural as the shot that is shown is pretty much what you see in real life. You can really play with this setup and find the style that you want, as it is an equal ratio of both the subject and the background. You don't need to worry about the depth of field with this setup, as you aren't trying to isolate the subject or the background. Right, I'm going to put the aperture to 4.0. It hasn't really made a difference, so I'm going to put it up again to 4.5. This is making the subject darker, but the table light. So now I'm going to try and change it with the shutter speed. I'm going to try and put my shutter speed up to 40 to see what that does. That's made it a bit darker. I'm going to put the shutter speed back to 30 and try the ISO at 200. The ISO exposed the picture more than the other two did, so I'm going to keep it at 100. I quite like the look of this now. There isn't any settings that you need to sacrifice for this setup, but I would advise that you keep your ISO as low as possible. If you do need to change it, try not to go over 800, otherwise your shot will start going grainy. You should try and keep your shutter speed as low as possible. Unless you are doing handheld or you've got a fast moving object, then I advise you to put your shutter speed higher so you don't get any blur. How light or dark you want the outcome to be. It depends what type of feel you want for the shot. If you wanted it to be darker, you would obviously bring the aperture back down. But if you wanted it to be brighter, you would either put the aperture up again, or if necessary, the shutter speed up. This is setup number 2. This setup is if you don't want much going on in the background, but you want to be solely focused on the subject. The best lens to use for this is the 24 to 70mm lens. Mine is not accurate as I don't have the lens, but the theory is there. This is what the focal length would be at 24mm. I have brought the camera and the tripod back from the subject and I am going to zoom in so I have less background. Now that I have zoomed in, there is less light going through the lens, which means I need to change my settings to make it brighter. When I zoomed in, the f-stop automatically adjusted to a new focal length. I now need to sacrifice the aperture as it will allow more light through the lens. When I change the aperture now, I'll be sacrificing the shallow depth of field. It doesn't matter too much, it just means the background will be in focus, but because the shot is close to the subject, it still means the subject is the main priority. As I don't have the actual 24 to 70mm lens, my f-stop is a lot higher than it should be. This just means I need to change another setting or my shot will start to bleach. I am now going to change my ISO to 200, I'll see what that does. It's still a little dark, but I'm happy with this shot. This is setup number 3. This setup is if you want a lot in the background but you want a shallow depth of field. This means the background is blurred but the subject is in focus. The best lens to use for this is the prime 50mm lens. Again, mine won't be accurate as I don't have the actual lens, but it's close enough. The 50mm lens is good for low light settings as it's a small lens, which means it lets more light in. I wouldn't recommend going under the aperture at 1.8 with this setup because if your subject moves slightly, they will go in and out of focus. So keep it over 1.8. My example isn't that great, but when you do actually use a 50mm lens, the background will be more blurry and the subject will be very much in focus. The best time to probably use this 50mm lens if you want to go under 1.8 aperture is when you've got a still object, so maybe like a flower that's not moving, so it stays in focus and the background goes blurry. I can't go lower on the f-stop as it is already high because of my lens, so I'm going to have to sacrifice another setting. I don't really want to touch the aperture because my subject isn't moving much and my camera's on a tripod, so I'm going to have to sacrifice my ISO. As long as you don't go over 800, you should be fine doing this. I am going to put the ISO to 200. This is not really ideal, but I am using natural lighting so I don't have the option to add more light. It definitely looks a lot better, but it is a little bit on the bright side. I can't touch the aperture at this point, so I am going to sacrifice the shutter speed. I am going to put the shutter speed from 30 to 40. I think that looks a lot better and I'm happy with this outcome.